So I'm Maisie. I was the writer on the project of the George Freeman work we did with the Royal Berkshire Archives and with the local schools. What I've created for the piece is I've got two poems that really try to reflect parts of George Freeman's life, what he went through, and also in the longer piece we wrote more about the questions we had, and that's, when we say we, I mean me, I mean the researchers who looked into George Freeman, and the kids from the schools, because what we found interesting, what the historians found interesting, isn't always the same as what kids find interesting about George Freeman. So a lot of the questions in the poems, one of the ones I remember that I took directly from the schools was, did George Freeman call the vicar dad? And that sort of language is really important in how we see history, and it doesn't have to be formal, it doesn't have to be disconnected from the people we are today and our family and who we have around us. In the other stories we wrote about, the kids were really interested in George Freeman's journey to England and what happened to him in England. So I wrote a lot about the church and his sort of step into that threshold, because a lot of what George went through is transitionary. He moved from place to place. The whole journey of this, the story of this, started as him being moved as part of the slave trade and him being taken away. So I wrote about his idea of this step into the church, this step into this next part of his life he was going through. And when we worked at the schools, a lot of what I got from the schools was this idea of how George felt. And that will never be written down in the historical record. That will never be something we find in the archives, how George felt about everything he went through. But I tried to write in the pieces of fiction what he might have felt. So I gave two different perspectives, one of which was slightly more hopeful for his new life, which we unfortunately know wouldn't last as long as he would have hoped for, and one that was more melancholic, one that knew that this life would not be perfect, that what he had gone through would always affect how he lived his life. So hopefully through this project, and what I got from the schools was, we can't for sure tell George Freeman's story because we don't know the truth, but even if the story we're telling isn't true about him, it would have been true about another young boy. Another George Freeman would have existed out there that we don't have record of, and that all the stories we tell and all the questions we ask will eventually tell those stories that have been left unspoken for too long.
I'm Euan. I worked on the George Freeman project and did the illustration in response to it. In some of the earlier ideas, there was a lot more historical details, or like details from his life that would tell the story of the things we know happened to him. But after doing the schools projects, talking to the kids, and things that I was telling them in the lessons about how the important thing is to bring the characters to life, make them feel like real people or real things that happened, because anyone can look at pictures of boats in a book or go to a museum. This is about someone who's actually alive, and it's his story that everyone connects with, and where our ideas about who he could have been come from. So the final composition ended up being more open, just telling a sort of, trying to show his journey from Africa and Sierra Leone in the background. The ships, him being liberated from the Portuguese slave ship, and then a sort of more bare space in the middle where there's fewer details, things we don't know about him, and the sort of passage of time and the distance before it comes around past the River Thames to the church where he lived, which is based on the real church, and George Freeman himself sort of walking into this blank space, which is the future, or whatever life he may have lived that we don't know about. And yeah, it was really interesting. My ideas about George Freeman, what could have happened to him, did change quite a lot doing the school project and talking to kids, because there's so much we don't know, but you still make certain assumptions or have certain sort of you end up with a certain idea without even realizing it. But it's so open, talking to people, the different things you'd never thought of, really does open it up and make you realize how little we know about him, how many possibilities there are of the sort of lives he could have lived, and yeah, certain things that I hadn't put so much importance on in the schools. A lot of people fixated on the boat, which seems sort of just like it's a very strong symbol, but it wasn't one I'd really given that much importance to. But actually, it's really at the centre of the story, and ended up being like right in the middle of the illustration. And it's sort of, apart from Freeman in the foreground, it's probably the most important part is the boat, because everything revolves around it. And yeah, people's ideas of what his life would have been like on the boat. He was on the boat for quite a long time. The importance it plays as a symbol of the history around it, as well as what happened to him, how he ended up in England, the people who were in his lives, the captain, as a result of being on the boat. So yeah, it ended up quite different to how I was originally going to approach it, but maybe more open, more narrative, and less fixated on the details. But yeah, it's a very interesting project to work with.